A 22-year-old Indiana woman suddenly inherits a billion-dollar fortune from a grandfather she never knew, only to uncover that her newfound empire was built on forbidden experiments, deadly secrets, and a legacy written in blood. When 22-year-old Claire Whitmore received the letter, her first instinct was disbelief. She had never heard of Whitmore Industries, and the name Leonard Whitmore meant nothing to her. Working long shifts at a Bloomington coffee shop barely paid her rent, and her life had always been simple, even ordinary. The letter, embossed with gold lettering from a Manhattan law firm, claimed she was the sole heir to an estate worth over $1 billion. Days passed before she called the number printed at the bottom, her voice trembling as she confirmed her identity. Within weeks, she was flown to New York in a private jet, welcomed by lawyers and advisors who addressed her as Miss Whitmore. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, flashing cameras as she signed inheritance papers she barely understood. It felt like a dream, until she saw the photographs of her grandfather, a stern man whose piercing eyes mirrored her own. He had died suddenly, leaving behind a business empire built over decades of secrecy and power. Yet, no one could explain why she, a granddaughter he had never met, had been chosen over dozens of corporate successors. Her new home, a vast mansion overlooking the Hudson River, was grand and silent. The air smelled faintly of old books and cedar, and the walls were lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch her every move. Despite the luxury surrounding her, an unsettling tension lingered, as though she had stepped into a story that had begun long before her birth. The staff was polite but distant, their eyes downcast whenever she asked about Leonard. And in the quiet hours of the night, Claire often wondered if inheriting a fortune from a stranger was truly a blessing, or the start of something much darker. The mansion stood like a museum of secrets, its grand halls echoing with silence that felt almost alive. Claire wandered through its endless corridors, each lined with portraits of solemn ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her. The air was heavy with history, carrying the faint scent of dust and faded perfume. Despite its beauty, something about the house unsettled her. The staff moved quietly, their steps soft, their conversations hushed. Whenever she entered a room, they seemed to pause, as if afraid to disturb whatever lingered unseen. One evening, she decided to explore the West Wing, a part of the house the caretakers rarely mentioned. The lighting there was dimmer, and the temperature dropped noticeably as she walked further down the hall. She found a heavy oak door locked tight, its brass handle cold to the touch. Curious, she checked the mansion's floor plan from her grandfather's study later that night, but the room wasn't marked anywhere. Near the desk, she discovered an old drawer that stuck halfway when pulled. Inside lay a faded photograph of Leonard Whitmore standing with two unfamiliar men, all smiling beside a large folder labeled Project Helix. None of their faces appeared friendly despite their smiles. Beneath the photo was a rusted key with an engraved W. She couldn't tell if it belonged to the locked door or something far worse. When she showed the photograph to the housekeeper the next morning, the woman turned pale and begged her to forget she ever found it. That night, as thunder rolled outside and lights flickered, Claire swore she heard faint footsteps in the hallway outside her room, slow, deliberate, and stopping just behind her door. For the first time, she realized the mansion didn't just hold memories. It held something alive. The news of Henry Lowell's death broke early on a gray Monday morning. Claire had only met him twice, but he had been her grandfather's most trusted financial advisor and the first person to guide her through the maze of the Whitmore inheritance. Police called it a suicide, found slumped over his desk with a revolver nearby. Yet as details surfaced, inconsistencies began to emerge. There was no gunpowder residue on his hands, and security footage from the office that night had mysteriously been erased. Reporters flooded the story with sensational headlines, calling it the first crack in the Whitmore empire. To Claire, it felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. Henry had left her a voicemail just hours before his death, his voice tense but controlled, asking to meet the next morning about something urgent he had discovered in the accounts. She never got to hear what it was. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere changed overnight. The staff whispered when they thought she wasn't listening, and she noticed unfamiliar faces among the security team, men who refused to meet her eyes. Each time she checked the security monitors, static blurred the image for a few seconds before returning. Anonymous phone calls came late at night, silent except for faint breathing and the low hum of interference. The sense of isolation tightened around her like a vice. At the funeral, Claire stood apart from the crowd, watching as the coffin was lowered into the ground. The air felt colder than it should have been. She couldn't shake the feeling that Henry hadn't died because of despair, but because of what he had found. As the last handful of dirt fell over the grave, Claire understood something terrible. Her inheritance had already begun claiming lives. Claire spent the following weeks buried in documents, determined to understand the empire she had inherited. Whitmore Industries stretched across continents, but its records were far from transparent. Late nights in the study turned into a routine, her desk buried under stacks of financial statements and legal files. That was when she began to notice odd discrepancies. Millions of dollars quietly transferred to offshore accounts under her grandfather's name, even after his reported death. Dates didn't match, signatures looked inconsistent, and some accounts were tied to non-existent subsidiaries. When she brought the matter before the board of directors, their reaction chilled her more than the numbers themselves. The room went silent. Some members exchanged wary glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man muttered that she was too young to dig into things she didn't understand. After the meeting, Evelyn Grant, one of the few board members who had shown her kindness, approached her privately. Her voice was low, almost trembling, as she warned Claire to stop asking questions. Leonard's death wasn't natural, she whispered before abruptly leaving. 2 days later, Evelyn vanished. Her home was found unlocked, her phone left on the kitchen counter, and her car abandoned miles away. Police suspected she had fled the country, but Claire didn't believe it. In a moment of desperation, Claire returned to the photograph she had found, the one labeled Project Helix. Searching through her grandfather's records, she discovered that the same phrase appeared in several internal memos coded under a defunct division of the company. It wasn't a business project, it was something hidden. Every attempt to access those files led to corrupted data or sudden power failures. The message was clear. Someone wanted those secrets buried, and Claire was getting too close. The investigator Claire hired was a quiet man named Thomas Reed, a former detective who specialized in corporate corruption. Within days, he uncovered more than Claire expected. Old company ledgers revealed that her grandfather had funded a secret research facility in rural Indiana nearly 15 years ago. The name that appeared most frequently beside his in the files was Dr. Marcus Hale, a biochemist who had vanished a decade earlier after accusing Whitmore Industries of unethical medical experiments. The connection was undeniable. Claire drove out to the listed location one foggy evening, following an overgrown road that led to a massive, decaying warehouse surrounded by dead trees. The building looked deserted, its walls streaked with rust and mold, yet the padlock on the main door was new. Inside, dust coated the floor, and the air smelled faintly of chemicals. Broken glass glittered under her flashlight as she moved deeper into the structure. Scattered papers lay across metal tables, some still stamped with the Whitmore Industries logo. One document bore the same words she had seen before, Project Helix star. Notes described experiments involving genetic enhancement and selective cellular regeneration, though many pages were blacked out. On the far wall, she found a strange symbol burned into the concrete, a helix surrounded by an open eye. Claire took photos quickly, her pulse pounding. As she turned to leave, she noticed a faint humming sound from a locked room nearby, followed by what sounded like movement. Panic surged through her, and she fled into the cold night. When she shared the evidence with Thomas the next day, his expression darkened. He warned her that people tied to Project Helix had disappeared before. What she found wasn't simply a hidden experiment. It was the center of something dangerous that refused to stay buried. The deeper Claire and Thomas dug, the more horrifying the truth became. Project Helix had been far more than a secret research initiative. It was an attempt to manipulate human DNA in pursuit of life extension. Leonard Whitmore had poured billions into developing a serum capable of slowing cellular decay, disguising the trials as legitimate medical research. But buried within the files were records of unregistered experiments performed on unwilling subjects. Many of the names were redacted, but one stopped Claire cold. Her mother's name, Anna Whitmore, appeared beside the label Test Subject 07. Notes beside it mentioned severe neurological decline and organ failure within 7 months. Claire realized that her mother's mysterious illness and sudden death when she was a child hadn't been natural. She had been one of her grandfather's experiments. The revelation shattered everything Claire believed about her family. Leonard hadn't just built his empire on ambition. He had built it on human suffering. Each division of Whitmore Industries had played a role, some funding the research, others hiding the results. The offshore accounts she'd uncovered now made sense. They were used to pay hush money, silence doctors, and erase evidence. Thomas urged her to go to the authorities, but even he seemed uneasy, warning that people involved in Helix still held power in government and law enforcement. That night, Claire burned her mother's medical records, watching the ashes swirl upward like ghosts. She no longer wanted justice. She wanted the truth. In the flickering firelight, she stared at her reflection in the window, searching for traces of the man who had done this. The resemblance was undeniable, the same sharp eyes, the same expression. For the first time, she wondered whether Leonard Whitmore's experiments had touched her, too. Robert Miles had been investigating Whitmore Industries for years, though Claire had never met him. His articles often hinted at hidden corruption and mysterious disappearances within the company, but his sources were always anonymous. When she learned he had reached out to Thomas, claiming to have evidence connecting Project Helix to several deaths, she agreed to meet him. The meeting never happened. Days later, Robert's car was found submerged in a river 30 miles outside the city. The police ruled it an accident caused by a late-night drive and slick roads, but the details didn't add up. His seatbelt had been cut, and the brake lines were cleanly severed. The evidence pointed to sabotage, yet no investigation followed. Claire felt the walls closing in. Everyone who tried to expose the truth was dying. She began receiving unmarked envelopes, each containing a single photograph of someone tied to the company with a red X drawn across their face. One morning, she found one of herself. Panic blended with fury as she realized that whoever was orchestrating these events wanted her silenced next. When she brought her concerns to the local police, the detective assigned to her case seemed oddly detached. He assured her it was nothing to worry about and advised her to stop drawing attention to herself. That was when she understood the reach of her grandfather's influence. The empire had not died with him. It was still alive, still operating in the shadows, protecting the very secrets she was trying to expose. That night, she packed a small bag and left the mansion. She drove with no destination, headlights cutting through the fog, unsure who to trust. Each passing mile carried the same terrifying thought. Every truth she uncovered demanded another life in return. Weeks passed in hiding, but Claire's determination only grew stronger. She stayed in cheap motels, constantly switching locations while continuing to dig through encrypted files Thomas had recovered before disappearing without a trace. Late one night, she received an anonymous email containing a scanned copy of a second will, one that contradicted the version made public. Her name was still listed as the legal heir to the fortune, but a separate clause mentioned a hidden inheritance, a set of research archives meant for someone identified only by the initials MH. The name hit her instantly. Dr. Marcus Hale, the scientist who had vanished years ago. The document included a handwritten note from Leonard himself, reading, asterisk, "She must finish what I started." Asterisk. The message haunted her. For the first time, she questioned whether she had been chosen not to dismantle her grandfather's empire, but to continue it. The files attached to the email contained coordinates in upstate New York, pointing to a private storage facility under a false company name. When Claire arrived, the clerk recognized her immediately and handed her a small steel case already paid for years earlier. Inside were hard drives, documents, and a photograph of Leonard and Marcus Hale, smiling beside lab equipment. Scribbled on the back were the words Helix, success at last. Back in her motel room, Claire studied the drives, their encrypted contents protected by a password she couldn't crack. One file name stood out, Prototype X. The more she stared at it, the more she realized her grandfather's empire wasn't just a business legacy. It was a plan, a blueprint for something designed to outlive every generation. If Marcus Hale was still alive, he was the last person capable of revealing what Leonard had truly created. And Claire wasn't sure she wanted to know. Days turned into nights as Claire worked to decode the files inside the steel case. Each document revealed a darker layer of what her grandfather had built. The serum, labeled Helix, was never intended to cure disease. It was designed to control evolution. The research aimed to enhance the human body's ability to regenerate, effectively slowing aging. But the results were catastrophic. Subjects suffered from violent psychosis, genetic instability, and eventual organ collapse. Among the scattered files was a video recording dated 2 years before Leonard's death. The footage showed Dr. Marcus Hale alive, older but unmistakable, speaking directly to the camera. He mentioned that Leonard had tested the serum on himself and that the side effects were accelerating. Hale warned that the research had gone too far and vowed to destroy it. The video ended abruptly with the sound of footsteps and the camera crashing to the floor. Claire realized that Leonard's supposed heart failure had likely been staged. He hadn't died of natural causes. Someone had ended his life to keep the secret buried. When she examined the autopsy report, inconsistencies stood out. Missing lab samples, altered dates, and a signature from a doctor who no longer existed in any record. She could now see how every death, the advisor, the board member, the journalist, was part of a chain reaction to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. In one final encrypted folder, Claire found a scanned image of her own DNA profile. It was labeled Helix Subject Continuation. The date on the document was recent, signed just weeks before Leonard's death. Terror gripped her as realization set in. She wasn't just the heir to a fortune. She was the living continuation of her grandfather's experiment, and the final stage hadn't yet begun. When Claire leaked the evidence to the media, it triggered chaos across every level of the Whitmore empire. Major news outlets flooded with headlines exposing decades of genetic experimentation, corporate corruption, and falsified medical trials. Arrests followed quickly. Executives, scientists, and politicians who had profited from Leonard's secret network were taken into custody. The stock value of Whitmore Industries collapsed overnight, erasing billions within hours. But Claire found no peace in the destruction she had caused. Every time she stepped outside, she felt eyes on her. The threats arrived daily: anonymous calls, strange vehicles parked outside her safe houses, and messages warning her that Helix wasn't meant to end. Even in hiding, she felt the empire's reach closing around her. Months later, she received a small brown package with no return address. Inside was a glass vial filled with a clear, faintly glowing liquid, labeled *Helix, Prototype X. Beneath it lay a handwritten note signed with her grandfather's initials. For you, my perfect creation. Her hands trembled as she read the words, realizing that Leonard's vision had always been centered on her. Somewhere in the experiments, her genetic code had been altered, refined to carry forward what he started. The serum in her hands was both the key to everything and the curse she could never escape. Claire drove to the edge of a frozen lake that night, standing beneath the gray sky as wind howled through the trees. She held the vial tightly, its glow reflecting in her eyes. If she destroyed it, the secret would die with her. But if she kept it, the power that had consumed generations would survive. As the first snow began to fall, she whispered to the darkness, unsure whether she was ending her family's legacy or becoming it.